Compliance risk is being priced into supplier contracts. Compliance risk has traditionally been framed as a reporting, enforcement, or regulatory alignment issue. That framing is now proving insufficient. In early 2026, compliance exposure is no longer confined to internal controls or disclosure systems. It is increasingly being priced into supplier relationships, quietly reshaping procurement economics, contract structures, and risk allocation across global supply chains. Once compliance risk enters commercial pricing, it stops being a theoretical exposure. It becomes a cost, a constraint, and a negotiation variable. From compliance signals to commercial consequences, regulatory expectations around environmental performance, safety, and operational transparency have continued to tighten across jurisdictions. On their own, these pressures are familiar. What is changing is how they are being absorbed by suppliers. Across sectors, suppliers are responding to heightened scrutiny by increasing prices to reflect documentation, audit, and verification costs, narrowing the scope of warranties and performance guarantees, shifting liability back to buyers through contract language, reassessing which customers or markets are worth the compliance burden. These responses are not driven by ideology or resistance. They are rational reactions to rising exposure. For suppliers, compliance obligations now carry operational, legal, and financial consequences that must be accounted for somewhere. Increasingly, that accounting happens at the contract level. Procurement is where compliance exposure becomes financial risk. For many organizations, compliance functions remain structurally separate from procurement. That separation is becoming harder to sustain. Procurement teams are now encountering compliance exposure as higher input costs tied to assurance and reporting requirements, reduced supplier optionality as smaller vendors exit regulated markets, longer onboarding timelines driven by data and documentation demands, less favorable contract terms as suppliers protect themselves from downstream risk. What looks like a pricing issue on the surface is often a compliance signal underneath. Supplier cost increases, qualification delays, and contractual resistance are frequently early indicators of regulatory and disclosure pressure being pushed outward. Supplier assurances are no longer low-risk inputs. Historically, many organizations relied on supplier self-attestations, standardized questionnaires, and contractual representations to manage compliance risk beyond their direct operations. That model is under strain. As reporting regimes mature and third-party verification becomes more common, supplier-provided data is increasingly treated as durable evidence rather than contextual input. Inconsistencies, gaps, or overly optimistic assumptions can create exposure not only for suppliers, but for buyers relying on that information in disclosures, audits, or regulatory filings. The result is a growing tension. Companies are being asked to stand behind information they do not fully control, while suppliers are becoming more cautious about what they are willing to certify. Why this shift matters now. This pricing of compliance exposure into supplier relationships marks a structural change, not a temporary adjustment. Organizations that continue to treat compliance as an internal function risk being surprised by rising procurement costs that appear disconnected from market fundamentals, supplier attrition in highly regulated categories, contract disputes rooted in data accuracy and disclosure obligations, misalignment between sustainability commitments and supplier capacity. In contrast, companies that recognize procurement as the next compliance boundary are beginning to adapt, revisiting supplier engagement models, rethinking contract language, and aligning procurement strategy more closely with regulatory and reporting realities. In 2026, that movement is carrying compliance risk directly into sourcing decisions, supplier negotiations, and cost structures. Procurement is no longer downstream of compliance. It is where compliance exposure becomes operational, financial, and contractual risk. That is where the next set of constraints is forming. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.